For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and concur in the Senate amendments to H.R. 515.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 515, an act to protect children from exploitation, especially sex trafficking and tourism, by providing advance notice to intended travel by registered child sex offenders outside the United States to the government of the country of destination, requesting foreign governments to notify the United States when a known child sex offender is seeking to enter the United States and for other purposes. Senate amendments.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, and the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume, and I also ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend and to include extraneous materials on this measure.
Ordered, and the gentleman is now recognized for such time as he may consume.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, child predators thrive on secrecy, a secrecy that allows them to commit heinous crimes against the weakest and most vulnerable. Today, the House has under consideration H.R. 515, the International Megan's Law, to prevent child exploitation and other sexual crimes through advance notification of traveling sex offenders, a law that will significantly thwart child sexual exploitation in the United States and abroad through a comprehensive and efficient system that warns law enforcement of traveling sex offenders. Mr. Speaker, I first introduced International Megan's Law back in 2008. It has passed the House 3 times, in 2010, 2014, 2015, and thankfully passed the United States Senate in December. International Megan's Law honors the memory of Megan Kanka, a precious little girl from my hometown of Hamilton who suffered and died at the hands of a sexual predator. Megan was just 7 years old when she was kidnapped, raped, and brutally murdered in 1994. Her assailant lived across the street, and unbeknownst to her family and other residents in the neighborhood, he was a convicted, repeat sex offender. Due to the extraordinary work by Megan's courageous parents, Maureen and Richard Kanka, the New Jersey State Legislature passed and the governor signed the original Megan's Law in 1994, expanded it in 2001, and it requires registration and public notification of convicted sex offenders living in the community. Today, all 50 states and all U.S. territories have a Megan's Law. Because of this law, parents, guardians, school officials, sport coaches, law enforcement, and the public at large are now empowered with the critical information they need to mitigate harm to children. We know from law enforcement and from media documentation that Americans on the U.S. sex offender registries are caught sexually abusing children in Asia, Central and South America, Europe, frankly, everywhere. A deeply disturbing 2010 report by the GAO found that at least 4,500 U.S. passports were issued to registered sex offenders in fiscal year 2008 alone. Typically, Mr. Speaker, a passport is valid for 10 years, meaning some or many of the tens of thousands of registered sex offenders possessing passports may be on the prowl internationally looking to exploit and to abuse. Ernie Allen, who served for 30 years as the president and CEO of the Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, recently said, and I quote, "It is clear that there is a substantial category of offenders who do not offend as a lapse of judgment. They do it as a lifestyle. And these are the offenders who are most likely to travel, to seek victims in places where the offender is most likely to be anonymous and most likely to avoid identification and apprehension." Close quote. Studies suggest and demonstrate that even when caught, prosecuted, and jailed for a number of predators, the propensity to recommit these crimes at a later date remains. For example, a 2008 study by Oliver Wong and Nikolajczyk showed that untreated sex offenders were reconvicted for sexual crimes at a rate of 17.7% after 3 years, 24.5% after 5 years, and 32% after 10 years. Keep in mind, Mr. Speaker, that these are just the rates for those who were caught again and then convicted. Pedophiles and other sexual predators often harm more than one victim, and there are different studies that showed large numbers of child victims and large numbers of acts committed against those children. For every victim who reports, there are likely many others who could not, would not, and cannot come forward. Mr. Speaker, some of those exploited children are prostituted by human traffickers to pedophiles. The International Labor Organization has estimated that some 1.8 million children are victims of commercial sexual exploitation around the world each year. So it is imperative that we take the lessons learned on how to protect our children from known child sex predators within our borders and expand those protections globally to prevent convicted U.S. sex offenders from harming children abroad. It is imperative that we teach other countries how to establish their own Megan's Law and push other countries to warn us in the United States when their sex offenders are traveling here. Specifically, H.R. 515 will authorize and empower the Angel Watch Center, operating under the auspices of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to check flight manifests against sex offender registries and quickly warn destination countries when sex offenders are headed their way. The Angel Watch Center is authorized to send actionable information about child sex offender travel to destination countries in a timely fashion for those countries to assess the potential damage and dangers to their kids and respond appropriately, whether it is to deny entry or a visa, monitor travel, or to limit travel. To prevent offenders from thwarting international Megan's Law notification procedures by country hopping to an alternate destination not previously disclosed, H.R. 515 includes provisions for the State Department to develop a passport identifier, or as we put it in the bill, any visual designation affixed to a conspicuous location on the passport indicating that the individual is a covered sex offender. A passport, Mr. Speaker, so identified, provides law enforcement and customs an additional tool to protect children. The passport identifier is only for those who have been found guilty of a sex crime involving a child and have been deemed dangerous enough to be listed on a public sex offender registry. When this information is no longer public knowledge in the United States, in other words, they're off the registries, the passport identifier in like manner will no longer be required. It is worth noting that some states already require sex offenders to have their status listed on their driver's licenses: Alabama, Florida, Delaware, Louisiana, to name a few. Ironically, it has been reported that some registered sex offenders have used their passports as ID in order to keep their status secret. Mr. Speaker, in order to protect potential victims, H.R. 515 also aims to establish a durable system of reciprocity among the nations of the world. International Megan's Law directs the Secretary of State to seek agreements with other countries so that the U.S. is notified in advance of incoming sex offenders. I would like to offer my profound appreciation, Mr. Speaker, to Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy for his deep and abiding commitment to combating human trafficking in all of its ugly manifestations, for scheduling the House vote 12 months ago on International Megan's Law and another dozen or so anti-human trafficking measures sponsored by members from both sides of the aisle. That was historic. It had never been done like that before. So I thank you for that leadership and for working closely with the Senate in order to help bring this day this bill to fruition. His policy advisor, Emily Murray, was remarkable, as was and is Kelly Dixon. I'd like to thank our distinguished chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Ed Royce, and ranking member Elliot Engel for their strong support for this bill, and for the assistance of Jessica Kelch, Doug Anderson, and Janice Keguayatan for her help. And Janice will remember she traveled with one of my staffers years ago, ascertaining this terrible, or investigating this terrible issue, which is a global scourge. Senator Bob Corker, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee on the Senate side, truly made this bill a priority and carried it over the finish line in the Senate. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that. His professional staff, Caleb McCary, Counsel Sarah Ramick, showed remarkable dedication and persistence through multiple interagency negotiations. His Chief of Staff, Todd Womack, and Legislative Director Rob Strayer skillfully guided the bill through the process on the Senate side, and I can't thank them enough. I also want to thank my good friend Ben Cardin. Ben and I served and have served for decades on the Helsinki Commission for his support and for his efforts. I'm grateful to Senator Richard Shelby and Senator Barbara Mikulski for their assistance in driving better Angel Watch Center collaboration with the U.S. Marshal Service's Sex Offender Targeting Center. USMS will be required to vet names sent out by the Angel Watch Center and share previously vetted names with the center in order to maximize expertise, avoid duplication of efforts, and ensure accuracy of international notifications. I would note that Senator Shelby also championed the passport provisions that will ensure sex offenders with crimes against children cannot end run the system. I'd like to thank his professional staffer, Shannon Hines, who was extraordinarily smart and creative during this process. Thanks to professional staff Jen Decky, as well as Senator Mikulski's staffer Jennifer Eskra for their tireless work as well. Senator John Cornyn, Majority Leader, did not rest on his success earlier this year in navigating the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act through the Senate, but persisted until international Megan's Law was complete over on the Senate side. And last but not least, I'd like to thank my Chief of Staff, Mary Noonan, who has been tenacious in guiding this bill past obstacle after obstacle. Allison Hollaback, who worked energetically, effectively, and expertly with the agencies and other interested parties to achieve the final bill. I'd also like to thank my former top Foreign Affairs Committee staff member, Sherry Rickard, who spent countless hours over several years negotiating with disparate parties, trying to achieve passage of the bill. Those efforts, Sherry, were not in vain. I'd like to thank the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children for their strong endorsement of the bill, the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, ECPAC USA, and the Family Research Council for their input, counsel, and strong support. I, again, first introduced this bill in 2008 alongside Megan Kanka's parents, Maureen and Richard Kanka. Maureen and Richard, Mr. Speaker, are heroic people. They have fought for decades to spare children and their families from horrific crimes that can and must be prevented. While they still carry deep emotional and psychological scars, Maureen and Richard's selflessness, love of others, and vision have protected countless children from harm. Enactment of international Megan's Law will expand meaningful child protection at home and around the world, and I urge my colleagues to support it and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this measure and yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me first thank Mr. Smith from New Jersey for his leadership on human rights and anti-trafficking issues, and for his hard work on international Megan's Law. I also want to thank the Judiciary Committee for its bipartisan input on this bill. This legislation is the product of a lot of hard work and reflects a commitment to advancing practical and effective ways to help those victimized by sexual predators. This is hard to believe, but around the world today, there are tens of millions of victims of human trafficking, which is what we call modern-day slavery. Many of these victims are children exploited in prostitution. In many countries, extreme poverty and gaps in law enforcement create zones of impunity where sex offenders exploit vulnerable children. Sometimes local officials have no idea this is going on. Sometimes they turn a blind eye. And sometimes officials are even complicit in this crime. We have a responsibility to protect all victims and to crack down on this crime that destabilizes communities, fuels corruption, and undermines the rule of law. International Megan's Law aims to prevent child sex offenders and traffickers from exploiting vulnerable children when they cross an international border. This bill would establish an Angel Watch Center within ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and provide advance notice to foreign governments when a convicted child sex offender travels to their country. This bill will hopefully prevent some of these horrific crimes from taking place. But, Mr. Speaker, fighting modern slavery requires a much more comprehensive response. Beyond prevention, governments must do all they can to protect victims. Robust identification efforts, policies and procedures that get victims out of harm's way, comprehensive support services that include physical and mental health care, education opportunities, legal assistance, and reintegration with family and community. And, of course, aggressive investigations and prosecutions to go after those responsible for such heinous crimes. The reality is, and the sad reality, is that no single government or single law will put an end to human trafficking. But every step we take strengthens our ability to prevent these crimes, protect victims, and punish those responsible. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support the Senate amendment to H.R. 515, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger, a member of the Financial Services Committee, who has been very active in the fight against human trafficking.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chairman Smith, thank you so much for your leadership. In behalf of these individuals, thank you, Chairman Royce, for your strong leadership as well. Mr. Speaker, right now, more than 20 million people worldwide are caught up in the modern-day slavery. We call it human trafficking. This isn't just a problem over there. In the city I represent, Charlotte, Maria was trapped when she answered an ad for an aspiring actress. Rosa was snatched from a local gas station while waiting for a ride. My good friend Antonia Childs dreamed of owning a bakery when falling victim to human trafficking. Thankfully, Antonia was rescued and now leads a vital Charlotte organization rescuing women, including Maria and Rosa. As a nation, we must take responsibility for our part in this horrific, multi-billion-dollar illicit industry. And as a member of Congress, we must take an active role in ending human trafficking worldwide. That's why on January the 22nd, 2015, I became an original co-sponsor in support of Chairman Smith's H.R. 515, the International Megan's Law to Prevent Child Exploitation. H.R. 15 ensures foreign countries are notified when an American sex offender who has previously abused children is traveling to that country. It encourages foreign countries to provide us with the same vital information when the sex offender is traveling to America. It attacks the sickening practice of child sex tourism by requiring the United States to notify other countries when convicted pedophiles travel abroad. It encourages President Obama to use bilateral agreements and assistance to establish reciprocal notification so that we will know when convicted child offenders are coming here. International Megan's Law takes valuable lessons we have learned about protecting our children here in the United States and expands those protections globally, so all communities can join together to take the necessary steps to protect our children. Please join me in taking this important step to end modern slavery today. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from North Carolina yields. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers on our side, so I'd be prepared to close.
Mr. Speaker, it's a privilege to recognize the distinguished chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, Ed Royce, for 2 minutes.
Okay. Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. The chair recognizes.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support. This is House Resolution 515, the International Megan's Law, focused on preventing demand for child sex trafficking. And I really want to acknowledge the hard work by the member from New Jersey, Mr. Smith. His perseverance here as the bill's author, as he's tried on several occasions to get this through the Senate and to the President's desk. And with this action today, this bill, when it passes the floor, will go to the President's desk. And I think it is very important that we understand the magnitude of this problem, as he's tried to convey to us here, and how this is going to strengthen the hand of law enforcement. We want law enforcement to consider this a new tool, and it will combat the appalling industry of child sex tourism, in which adults travel overseas to exploit children in other countries. My Chief of Staff, Amy Porter, has gone on several missions, humanitarian missions, to work with very young children in Cambodia and elsewhere in South Asia as well. And as she shows you the photographs of these little girls exploited by this and traumatized by this predatory activity, it is hard to fathom that men from around the world, including America, including our country, engage in this predatory activity. And while the countries they travel to lack the resources needed to deal with this rising number of child predators, this legislation is going to help us offset that. One of the most discouraging things that my Chief of Staff, Amy, found was that in Cambodia, it was the local police chief who himself was involved in the practice. Now, upon her return to again check on this, she found that they'd put an end to that. He was no longer in this trade, in this type of business. It had been cleaned up some with pressure from the United States, but it is still ongoing. So this will help us fight back. At present, if I could ask for some more time, Mr. Smith. Thank you. At present, multiple U.S. government agencies are working to combat human trafficking and child sex tourism, but there has been a troubling lack of coordination and information sharing and notifications to foreign countries that a potential sexual criminal is heading their way, and those notifications are very inconsistent. And this bill clarifies the responsibility, puts it on the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security. It better coordinates those efforts, and importantly, by proactively helping other countries to identify those incoming child predators, we will encourage them to alert us when foreigners convicted of sex offenses against children attempt to enter our country, into the United States. So I commend Chairman Smith for his work on this bipartisan legislation, and I encourage all members to support its passage. It'll be on the President's desk here after our action this evening. Thank you, Mr. Smith, and thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from California yields. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Appreciate it.
To close with no further speakers, although
I would ask my good friend from Pennsylvania if he could yield us 2 of his minutes.
Yeah, before I close, I thought I would use some of my minutes, and in a show of bipartisanship, yield 2 minutes.
And Ed Wagner will be closing for us.
To Ms. Wagner. Or to Ms. Wagner or to Mr.
Yes.
Smith?
She'll be closing, so to...
Okay, I'll yield the 2 minutes to the other side of the aisle.
The gentlelady from Missouri is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for leading, for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 515, the International Megan's Law to prevent child exploitation. I'd like to thank, like so many have, Congressman Chris Smith for introducing this important legislation to protect innocent children from the evils of sexual predators in the United States and worldwide. As a mother who raised 3 beautiful children, I can tell you that the constant concern for their safety and protection never goes away. When they were young, I worried if they were safe at the playground down the street, if they were safe at the shopping mall or movie theater. Named after a young girl who was kidnapped, raped, and murdered at just 7 years old by her neighbor, Megan's Law and the public knowledge of predators in our communities have been critical tools in protecting our children and easing some of the many fears that parents feel every single day. I cannot fathom the anger and anguish felt by Megan's parents and all parents whose children fall prey to such sick predators. I would do anything to protect my children and all children from sexual predators, and I feel blessed that I and my colleagues are in a position where we can make a difference. We will be able to better identify and scrutinize sex offenders' activity, ensuring that they do not engage in the ghastly practice of sex tourism, either in our own neighborhoods or in any neighborhood around the world. The U.S. must take a leading role as a global defender of children from sexual abuse, often planning their trips around locations where the most vulnerable children can be found. Sex offenders should not be allowed to use the anonymity provided by foreign travel to help hide their hideous crimes. A 2010 Government Accountability Office report showed that in a single year, at least 4,500 registered sex offenders received U.S. passports to travel internationally. This is absolutely unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. During my time as a United States ambassador, I was exposed firsthand to the horrors of sexual abuse, of the human trafficking, and on the international level.
I yield, my friend, the remainder of our time.
Led by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, if he would like to yield any additional to the gentlelady from Missouri.
Yes, I'll yield additional 1 minute.
Gentlelady is recognized for an additional 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. And Mr. Speaker, as elected members of Congress, we must stand up for the powerless and we must provide a voice for the voiceless. And today, we are doing just that. Passing the International Megan's Law, which will provide advance notice of foreign travel by registered sex offenders, is critical. We owe it to the innocent angels like Megan to take these crimes out of the shadows and do everything we can to prevent future crime, both in the United States and across the globe. Today, I will vote to pass the International Megan's Law, and I encourage my colleagues to join me in providing protection for potential victims worldwide and greater peace of mind for those who love them. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady from Missouri yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
We have no further requests for time, Mr. Speaker, and I just want to say this is a bipartisan bill. It will save children's lives. It will prevent other victims like Megan Kanka from happening, not just in the United States, but around the world. And I think what my good friend Ann Wagner said a moment ago about, Megan is an angel. Her parents are guardian angels. They have taken a pain and an agony and a trauma that is incomprehensible and have worked tirelessly to get Megan's Law enacted throughout the United States and in some other countries. This will take it to the next level and will establish that true reciprocity regimen whereby we notice, they notice, everybody knows what's going on, to take the secrecy out of this travel when a convicted pedophile hops on a plane with the idea of exploiting children. So this will have a very measurable impact and will protect children from this kind of agony. So I thank you, and I do yield back the balance of our.
The gentleman from New Jersey yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, to conclude, I second the comments that were made by Mr. Smith. Congratulate the family of Megan Kanka. Being a father myself of a 2-year-old daughter, can't imagine losing a little girl, especially in the heinous way that they did. Remember very much when all of that happened. Hamilton, New Jersey is only about 40 minutes up the road from where I live in Philadelphia, and remember the ugly incident very well, and the fact that here we are so many years later, the family still continued to fight for other little girls and little boys is really remarkable and a testament to them. I also congratulate the gentleman, Mr. Smith, who I know has worked on this bill tirelessly for a long period of time. I congratulate him, and I urge all my colleagues to support this piece of legislation. And with that, I yield back through the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and concur in the Senate amendments to H.R. 515? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the Senate amendments are agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.